My name is Zipporah Berman. I'm the chair of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative and also the International Program Director at Stand.Earth. I'm speaking to you today from the unceded territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, the Squamish, and the Musqueam. So last year, I can't believe it was only 1 year ago today, at Climate Week, we officially launched the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. It's been an incredible year. We've seen the campaign grow immensely in terms of impact, in terms of partnerships and recognition. Since then, more than a dozen cities have passed motions to endorse the treaty, including Sydney, Vancouver, Barcelona, and Los Angeles. 101 Nobel laureates, such as His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama, Professor Muhammad Yunus, and many others. Former President Jose Ramos Horta, all called for an end to fossil fuel expansion in coordination with our campaign. And then just last week, more than 2,100 scientists and academics from around the world and across disciplines called for a fossil fuel treaty, including Katharine Hayhoe and many, many others. Michael Mann and David Suzuki. Also last week, 20 nationally elected parliamentarians from the Global South publicly made a call to their elected peers to take action towards a fossil fuel future. To date, we have 81 parliamentarians from 27 countries that have already signed on. We also to date have more than 700 civil society organizations representing hundreds of thousands of more individuals that have endorsed the treaty too. All this movement is on top of wider changes on this issue around fossil fuel supply and production, such as the IEA's 1.5 degree scenario calling for the end of fossil fuel expansion. And of course, the latest IPCC report sounding the death knell for fossil fuels. Finally, the world is shifting from whether we tackle fossil fuels to how. Still, the scale of the change is huge. It requires a bold response, and it will require continued effort in the weeks leading up to COP26 and beyond. As I think many of you who are joining us today from around the world know, while the world has been grappling with emissions and climate change mitigation now for many decades, and countries have been moving forward with their pledges to decrease emissions, almost behind our backs, the fossil fuel industry has been expanding production and locking in more and more oil, gas, and coal production around the world. Of course, the production gap from the United Nations and Stockholm Environment Institute now tells us that we're on track to produce 120% more fossil fuels than the world can ever burn and stay below 1.5 degrees. So today we have a wonderfully diverse panel of speakers from our network to reflect really on the past year and discuss the work that we have left ahead. We have less than an hour to discuss it all. But we will have lots of time for questions. So please put those questions into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Our staff and network partners will try and address the questions as we go, and we'll also be addressing them live in this discussion. We're so lucky today to be joined by some incredible speakers. Bill Mckibben, of course, all of you know, the founder and senior advisor emeritus of 350.org and author of The End of Nature, among many other books. I actually, Bill, every time you put out a new book, I think, where does he get the time? And excitingly, part of the Fossil Fuel Treaty campaign, as well as many campaigns, and has started a new initiative this year, which I'm sure he'll tell us a bit about. We also have Tamara Tolles O'Loughlin. She's the president and CEO of the Environmental Grantmakers Association. She's a renowned national climate strategist and environmentalist focused on equity, access, and community, with 2 decades of cross-sector environmental experience. We have João Ducini, is a Brazilian climate and animal activist with Fridays for the Future, anonymous for the Voiceless in Sao Paulo, and a member of the treaty's youth space. João runs @7OurWorld, an Instagram page where he tries to raise awareness about the negative impacts of human beings on climate change in the animal industry as well. Nikki Reese is the Director of Climate and Energy Program at the Center for International Environmental Law. Her work focused on human rights and environmental harms, including litigation before domestic and international courts. She's held several positions with CUNY and the NY School of Law, appearing before many UN treaty bodies. And last but not least, Brenna Two Bears is Dene, Ho-Chunk, and Standing Rock Lakota. Brenna founded the Indigenous Peoples Education and Cultural Collective and supports the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative as the Fossil Fuel Phase-Out Communications Associate. Brenna has focused on uplifting voices that often go unheard, including grassroots organizing, consultation on behalf of Indigenous communities, and working with youth. So without further ado, I'm going to turn to our panelists so you can hear from them. Bill, first to you, because I know this is a very busy day for you. Governments around the world, including the United States, are calling for strong climate action ahead of COP26. But meanwhile, their support of the fossil fuel industry continues to grow. So how do you see the treaty helping combat this disconnect? And how can we put pressure on governments to walk the talk?
Well, Zipporah, first of all, what a pleasure to be with you and to be part of this great panel, to see my old friend Tamara and Brenna and so many others who are really stepping up here. Look, let's talk realistically about how politicians tend to view the climate crisis that we've wandered into. They know now, because we've built huge movements, that they have no choice but to take some action. If they don't, they'll face real consequence from publics who are very tired of their forests burning down, their basements flooding, all the other things that we see in the early days of climate change. So what they generally try to do are the things that politicians like to do, which is give money to new things for people to go set up. So right now, happily say in the US, we're talking about a huge reconciliation bill that'll spend lots of money on new EV chargers and solar panels and wind turbines and all kinds of things that are really important to be spending money on because we have to make an energy transition to clean energy. But what politicians generally don't like doing as much is saying no to anybody, especially if those anybody's are extremely rich and powerful corporations like the ones that comprise the fossil fuel industry. After all, the richest industry in the world for many, many decades, with deep history of political access. And so while on the one hand, they're busy building some of the infrastructure for the world we need in the future, they're on the other hand busily blessing the continuation of the world that we have right now. And one understands that political strategy and why it would be nicer to do that. The problem is that physics isn't standing for it. Climate change in the end is a math problem. It's many other things too, including the deepest questions about justice that we've ever encountered in many ways. But it's also a math problem. And you can only make it work if you leave most of the fossil fuel that we know about in the ground. That's as important as the work of building out all the renewable energy. They obviously go in hand because we need power to propel our lives. But this is the only way, doing both sides of this equation, the positive and the negative, that we have any chance of making the math of climate change work. And so the treaty is a very powerful vehicle for making our leaders face up to that essential mathematical problem. And one of the virtues of a treaty is that if a lot of countries around the world are doing something, it becomes easier for other leaders in other places to join in, to say, this is what's happening around the world. We have no choice but to take part. This is the consensus that's been building. And so the work behind this treaty, in a way, is an effort both to put pressure on politicians to do the right thing and to give them a way to do that right thing within the framework of the world as they understand and navigate it. I'll just say that that there could not be anything, in a sense, less radical or more completely rational than simply saying, yes, we're going to follow the obvious math of climate change where it leads. Having said that, there also are extraordinarily important other parts of this idea that are of inestimable value to the human project in all kinds of other ways. One, the energy that we're talking about leaving in the ground is the energy of oligarchs, of the powerful, of people who are from the Koch brothers to the king of Saudi Arabia, distorting democracies and abusing human rights around the world. The second thing is, even if the planet was not heating up, we would desperately want to be taking these steps because fossil fuels turn out to be incredibly damaging in all kinds of other ways. The new data from this year indicates that simply breathing the combustion products of fossil fuels, the particulates that emerge when you burn coal and gas and oil, kills 8.7 million human beings a year, more than HIV, AIDS, malaria, and TB combined. It's 1 death in 5. That's not, I suppose, an existential crisis the way that climate change is for our civilizations, but it's an existential crisis if you have to live next to the freeway and breathe this stuff day in and day out, long past the point when there's any need to. The final thing I'll say is it should be easier with each passing day for our leaders to endorse this action because the only victims of it, the only people who suffer are the people who own coal mines and oil wells. At this point, the replacement power from the sun and the wind is cheaper, not only cleaner, but cheaper than the power we're generating from fossil fuels. So we can and should move aggressively in this direction. And I just hope that everybody figures out how to work, how to sort of rally behind this call. There are easy ways in the, at the website for the treaty for people to join in, to round up the legislators they know at every level, state, local, and national, in order to get behind this, this remarkable idea. I want to thank everybody who's brought it forward, beginning Zipporah with you and with your colleagues. We don't have a hell of a lot of time at this point to mess around. And that's why it's really important that this straightforward and obvious and powerful idea is out there in the world and gaining adherence every day. I am sorry to have to go, but there's many fronts in this fight. This one is a truly important one. Thank you all for doing it, and many, many thanks to my fellow panelists for their perseverance in all these fights.
Thank you so much, Bill. Really appreciate your support of the treaty initiative, but also your many years of work, and good luck with the rest of your crazy day and Climate Week. You know, I want to pick up on two things that Bill mentioned. One was the importance of data. One of the first initiatives of the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative was to actually look at, do we have transparent and accountable data on who's producing what and for how long? And we were pretty shocked to find out that we don't globally, that countries aren't accountable for their production. They're accountable for their emissions data every year, but not for their production. We produced a white paper last year on the global registry of fossil fuel production and talked to folks from around the world about that. And I'm happy to say that it was taken up, and Carbon Tracker and Global Energy Monitor will be producing the first prototype of the global registry of fossil fuel production to be released at COP26, which is super exciting. And then, you know, I want to build on a point that Bill made last year when we launched this initiative. We were talking about the importance of governments. And as someone who has worked for many, many years and, you know, on divestment and fossil fuel divestment and financial campaigns, and of course, many of us work on that as well. One of the things Bill said last year, which has just really always stuck with me, is that no matter, we have to, encourage people to move their money. We have to encourage responsibility from private institutions right now on their fossil fuel investments in order to stop fossil fuel expansion. But we can't let governments off the hook. And especially right now, when we're talking about a just transition, the how to get off fossil fuels, it's increasingly important to have a call to governments to do the right thing and to cooperate so that this happens internationally. So want to move now over to you, Tamara. One of the pillars of the treaty is to fast track real solutions and a just transition for every worker, community, and country, especially those that are most affected. And I'm wondering if you can provide some insight of the demands coming from vulnerable communities in the US, and specifically where these demands connect to those communities across the globe calling for a global just transition. Just an easy one to start you off.
Thank you. I feel like summarizing the cry of communities made vulnerable by the system that delivered them there. I can do this 2 minutes. I think it's really exciting time for us all to be in this conversation because, as I said last year at the launch, there is no domestic climate policy that is not global climate policy. There are no changes that can be made in one place and not another. And for communities that have been yelling this, demanding that their municipalities provide home rule protections, that their states and their communities listen to them at the level of just defending their right to breathe clean air and drink clean water. This is another moment where folks who have been demanding for a really long time that the sovereignty of our relationship to our government be honored in all the ways that we've agreed to just by virtue of our birth, and why those rights connect to a universal discussion that has to happen in lots of government offices and rooms that we're not in. It used to be smoke-filled corridors, and now it's the Zoom where it happens. We need people to lift up the demand for dignity, the right not to be treated as a criminal, to move around as flood and fire demands that you remove yourself from the places that you were used to call home. And so the demands coming from the community are the same. Don't patronize us. Don't tell us that you can't do what you can do. Don't tell us that the reserves that you hold command over, monitor, and develop your entire markets around, not things you could change in a heartbeat as you quietly make investments in the future that don't include us. So I think the demands of the registry for a registry that actually tracks the information, the people on the ground, are what give Twitter and Instagram and Reddit and Substacks life. We understand open source. We understand what it means to track the data, to match it to numbers, and to use the power of people. BTS is all giving a statement at the UN. Why would that happen in a universe where the people aren't already really clear on their demands for a future that ends fossil fuels? So we are already here in this moment. So what we demand is what we've always demanded, that the people who we've sent to the big hill to do our work actually do it. And that looks like, in this context, no longer co-signing on our behalf to destroy our future. We are here for the end of coal, oil, and gas because we're here for our futures. We don't want to be sold false solutions. We don't want to be told that if we just continue to wait, that if we invest in the next scheme, that if we turn farmers into market capitalists, we'll be able to do the work that keep it in the ground could do tomorrow. In some sense, I can tell you from plenty of folks who are trying to consider whether or not to risk their health to go to COP, that a lot of things that are happening there where people will risk their health to travel to make a stand are things that governments could do without talking to us. They could probably do it through a couple of emails, a few meetings, and a couple of signatures. So to be quite frank, fossil fuel non-proliferation is really a vehicle for us to bring all of our power into the conversation, to force our governments to do what they already know they should be doing, which is to create the roadmap, start the just transition, and end it before it ends us. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Tamara. That was so very powerful. And it seems to me that when we're talking about just transition, when we're talking about communities and equity, I mean, part of the reason that I love working on the treaty initiative is that there's a piece around what is the plan, and transition for ensuring justice in communities, in fossil fuel supply areas, that leaves no worker or their family behind, especially for the wealthy countries. I mean, you're living in the US, I'm living in Canada. the majority of expansion of oil and gas that's planned in the next 5 years is in our two countries. So part of one of the principles of the treaty initiative is that the wealthy countries need to act first. And I think this year that's critical for us to be really pushing North America, but also, of course, Norway, the UK, who are still planning fossil fuel expansion and really wealthy. But the second piece that your comments remind me of is the need that for a global just transition and addressing equity. And often we hear people talking about a just transition, but there really isn't an international conversation about how to ensure cooperation to ensure a global just transition in countries of the global South. And that again is a role that wealthy countries can play, and in some ways I see the treaty as a way for those important negotiations and discussions on how to stop fossil fuel expansion, how to support countries in the global South to stop fossil fuel expansion in order to meet the Paris Agreement. And I really found in our first year that a lot of people that I talked to in the US, even elected officials, they thought, well, the Paris Agreement does this already. And they didn't really realize that there are no mechanisms to stop the production, very few within the Paris Agreement. So I'm just wondering, in the run up to COP26, priorities that you see then, therefore, for the Biden administration in that kind of international space around equity or global trust transition, if you wanted to add any other comments.
I mean, it's hard to be an example of a thing you are not even aspirationally. So one, I think, is a question of political license. I can't be a lifelong campaigner and organizer if I don't lift up the idea that it's very difficult to demand that other nationalities, other communities, other governments sacrifice quality of life, the ability to have basic institutional protections, buffers from the global market if the US isn't putting the goods on the table. I think our very license to operate in global space, especially given the expletive show that we've had the last handful of years, our only license to operate is our own commitment to making this shift ourselves. And that's not just about making sure that we say the right things into the camera or that we bring the right babies and clutch them deep to our bosom. It's really about whether or not we are willing to make sure our reserves are tracked to the future we want to have, that our market signals are tracked to the future that we want to support, that the leadership looks like the folks on the ground who are calling for change to happen and sets up the future to respond to it. What really attracted me to the treaty at first was the idea that a municipality could develop its own language for a treaty, that the state level houses where there's actually a lot of police power just to protect your general health and safety can act on your behalf in ways that even the federal government cannot do in the US context. And so there are places where the treaty can stand in to remind legislators that their duty is not just to wear the nice suit and smile directly at the light, but actually to come up with resolutions, with bills with teeth, with things that restrain the power of government to spending our money on stuff that we don't agree to do. So I do think that there is a role underneath the umbrella of the treaty for every level of government, and whether that is Congress and AOC and Cori Bush, who are doing this work every day, whether it is folks on the climate committee, energy committee, the agriculture. These are folks who are looking at these things from different angles, and the kind of power that the treaty language can bring in to give them some levers to use these old mechanisms until we build some new ones, and to empower them to pass some laws so we can start moving that money away from the folks that hurt us to the folks that need us. This is one of the few and only pathways that I have seen as a person whose job it is in general to be looking out for the best ideas. The reason that you'll often find me in treaty space is because it's the best one I've seen yet. It's time, this isn't a luxury item. It is a necessity for our demands. And we can keep yelling at the future, or we can get on to doing something about it.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. I want to jump now from the North America to Latin America. Let's talk about Brazil. João, the youth climate movement has gained enormous momentum. Can you give us a little sense of what spurred you to join the climate movement in your home country? And I know you're also part of the treaty youth space for activists 29 and under. So what's happening there? What are the plans in the run up to COP26?
Hi, first of all, thank you for having me today. We are in a climate crisis. So, and Brazil is part of the most affected areas, which we call MAPA, most affected people in areas. So I couldn't see everything and not do anything. Of course, Brazil doesn't have as much historical responsibility as global north countries, but what we are doing to nature, especially right now, is unacceptable. And we are among the top current contributors to the climate crisis right now, according to the National Climate Observatory. We are emitting more than 2 gigatons of CO2 equivalent every year. And it doesn't have to be like this. It cannot be like this. Our emissions are increasing and it has to stop. Our current president, Bolsonaro, and his government are more than ever trying to end laws that protect indigenous people's lands from exploitation, thus their safety and lives as well. So indigenous peoples are being constantly threatened by his government, and also our ecosystems, our nature, forests, and so on. Fossil fuels are our generation's weapons of mass destruction. They are based on a system that seeks profit and GDP growth above everything else. And this system needs to be uprooted if we want to avoid the worst consequences of the climate crisis. This Friday, we are going to have a global climate strike, and our hashtag is uproot the system. Things cannot keep going like this. With fossil fuel companies investing billions of dollars every year to promote misleading propaganda just to make sure people don't understand the real consequences of their destructive and exploitative actions. So only a few keep making money while inequality increases and human well-being is placed in the background. About COP, of course, we are not solving everything there. There's like it's been said before, there's not one single event or one single thing that's going to solve the climate crisis because, like we say, this is a crisis and there's no silver bullet at all. But me and other fellow activists from uncountable movements are going to put pressure on global leaders there to stop with their empty promises and demand climate action now. We've been doing this for a while and public awareness is growing more and more. And I believe that we are soon reaching a tipping point where society will no longer accept this kind of lie and this kind of treatment from global leaders towards people. And they will have no other option but to address the climate crisis in a just and equitable way. To finish, our time is running out and we need to make sure our voices are being heard. We need to make sure that global leaders will start treating the climate crisis as a crisis, and they will start listening to the science, which means divesting from fossil fuels, reinvesting in clean energy, and promoting a just transition, as well as providing ways for the most affected people and areas to deal with the extreme events we are already witnessing in many parts of MAPA countries, and also in many countries in the global north too, as we've seen in Europe and United States and many other places. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us and for your comments that are very, very inspiring. For someone who's been doing this now for over 30 years, seeing the next generation so informed and so passionate is gives me hope. Thank you also to Anne and Brenna who've been putting stuff in the chat. And I invite people to take a look at the chat. There is a Youth for Treaty letter that has now been posted and is circulating to youth groups around the world. So I encourage people to share that and circulate it. Also, we have a Q&A function at the bottom of our screen. We have some questions that have come in also already from other formats, but you can please ask questions in the Q&A and we will get to them shortly for all of our speakers. I want to jump now back to the US. And Nikki, I want to bring you into the conversation. So the world has changed quite a bit since we launched this last year at New York Climate Week. For instance, the US was still out of the Paris Agreement. You know, big oil has faced a remarkable set of shareholder votes and court rulings this year. And of course, the chorus of voices around the world calling for the end of fossil fuel expansion is really growing. So can you give us a sense of some of the legal wins that we've seen this year, but also some of the barriers that I know you and other lawyers are starting to look at in terms of how to stop fossil fuel expansion and how to move the treaty forward?
Sure. Well, first, thanks so much, Zipporah, and thanks all. It's really a pleasure to join this conversation and to be part of such an inspiring panel, and to have an opportunity to use Zhao's words just now to talk about how we're using the law to uproot the system. So wielding the law and working to change the law. And I think, you know, this past year has seen a truly remarkable number of legal wins around the world, really, by no means only in the US. First and foremost, I think just the sheer number, the diverse nature, and the geographic reach of the climate cases and cases challenging fossil fuel production, fossil fuel financing, and inadequate climate action is in and of itself a kind of legal win, right? It's about signaling that the tide is shifting, that business as usual production is not just morally unacceptable and financially risky, but carries legal consequences. And it's reflecting a really groundswell of demand for accountability around the world, not just for fossil fuel companies, but for those who bankroll their continued destructive activities. So to start with perhaps the most significant legal win in some ways this year from the perspective of fossil fuel phase out and industry accountability is really the landmark decision that was issued by a Dutch court in May, holding the Royal Dutch Shell, one of the largest oil companies in the world, must reduce its emissions 45% in the next 10 years. And this case is really significant. It marks a watershed moment because it's really the first legal recognition or court's recognition that companies bear legal responsibility to reduce their emissions because of the foreseeable impacts on climate change and of climate change on human rights and the environment. And significantly, the decision applies across Shell's global operations. So it's up and down its supply chain to its indirect emissions from the intended use of its products, that's the burning of fossil fuel. And it really marks a shift in corporate climate litigation from a focus on chiefly the historical responsibility of fossil fuel companies that are the primary drivers of the climate crisis to forward-looking responsibility, how we're going to be holding corporations and the governments that permit their activities accountable for the ongoing production of fossil fuels and planned future operations. So the message from that really key case is that continuing business as usual production carries legal consequences, that polluters can expect to see their day in court. And it's incredibly important, and there's already work to build on it and to replicate that. You know, in the same week as the Shell decision, which itself followed on the heels of a really important report from the International Energy Agency on net zero that called for an immediate halt to new oil and gas investments, shareholders, as Zipporah mentioned, dealt blows to Chevron and Exxon in the annual general meetings, voting for emissions targets at Chevron and a boardroom overhaul at Exxon in what was dubbed by some as a Black Wednesday for big oil. So, you know, Shell is by no means alone in facing mounting liability risk. I also want to mention, you know, some other important interim wins, such as a decision in February in France by a court to allow a lawsuit against the French oil giant Total for the inadequacy of its climate commitments to proceed in court. And while there isn't an outcome yet, the fact that the number and nature of these cases is mounting around the world is not going unnoticed by the industry, by governments, and really dovetails with a rising popular call for a fossil-free future. In the US, to turn to your question specifically, is that the number of cases brought by states and municipalities against fossil fuel companies has literally exploded in the last 12 months. There have been 9 new cases filed just since last September. And the cases are increasingly focusing on consumer protection, alleging fossil fuel industry deception and fraud, including one of the more recent cases by New York against Exxon, Shell, BP, and API for false advertising and greenwashing. And while there was a temporary small setback on a procedural issue by the Supreme Court, virtually every court to consider these cases has allowed them to go forward in state courts. So there's a really huge momentum behind the demand to hold the industry to account. And I think, I mentioned greenwashing, and I think that's another key marker of the progress over this past year has been the use and rise of pioneering cases to challenge the latest page in the industry's playbook of greenwashing attempts to shift from climate denial to deception around their own products and to paint them as carbon free or to make net zero pledges without backing them up. And we've seen cases filed in the US by Greenpeace and others challenging Chevron's deceptive advertisements. In Australia, just days ago, against Santos, a big oil company, challenging its promises of clean fuel and net zero targets without explaining how those can be reconciled with ongoing increases in oil production. On the two other things I really wanted to flag is that on the finance side, we're really seeing the huge impact of the growing movement, not only for divestment from fossil fuel and investment in communities, but the growth of the Stop the Money pipeline movement. And we're seeing that manifest not only in the growing number of voluntary divestment announcements, but also increasing pressure by shareholders and a growing willingness on the part of regulators to take these issues seriously. So in the US, one of the most important changes is the progress under the Biden administration and openness on the part of the SEC to regulate companies and force them to disclose climate risks and to disclose the assumptions behind their valuation of their fossil fuel reserves. And so we're working to influence those rules. And it's not just about regulating private companies, though. We've seen in the UK a lawsuit challenging government financing for overseas production of oil and gas. So a project bankrolling gas production in Mozambique. And that lawsuit is active, as are others in other parts of the world. The recent Harvard divestment announcement, I think, is really important to just call out, because after so many years of resistance from a big university like Harvard to divesting its fossil fuel holdings, they made an announcement just days ago that really indicates a change in understanding of what is required under the law to be a prudent investor in the midst of a climate emergency means shedding fossil fuel investments. And I want to make sure to lift up also the crucial wins on the legal challenges that have been brought by frontline communities to expanding oil and gas projects. I mean, this is, in some ways, it's a place to start this whole conversation, and it's certainly a place to bring it back, because those frontline fights are where the reality of the harm of fossil fuel production manifests. And as Bill said, it's not just about carbon and climate impacts, it's also about the local pollution impacts. And we've seen progress and wins and challenging a massive Formosa petrochemical plant planned in Louisiana on grounds of its climate and environmental justice impacts. We've seen the escalation of the fight over Line 3 and the legal wins recently defending the rights of human rights defenders and waterkeepers to not have police shut down their protests. We've seen also successes this year in challenges to LNG export terminals, trying to slow down the US's push to expand its #1 status as a producer of oil and gas, and major pending challenges around the world brought against massive oil pipeline in East Africa, offshore drilling in Guyana, fracking in Argentina. These fights are being led everywhere, and the law is being wielded for them. And I would be remiss not to mention, of course, as Zipporah said, that states have to be held to account for regulating their industries and for taking crucial, ambitious action. And we've seen critical wins this year in lawsuits challenging the inaction of states. So from Germany to France to Belgium and Australia, we've seen really important legal decisions that have held that inadequate action on climate today is at odds with human rights, with the fundamental rights of present and future generations, and compelling those states to take action. So I'll pause there. I know there are a lot of other questions on the table, but I've already covered a lot of ground.
Yes, you have. I was frantically taking notes, and then I remembered, and I thought I would remind people that this is being recorded, and we will send out the recording to all participants, and you can share it around. We'll also share it on our social media. There was a lot of information there. And it is really exciting what's happening in the legal sphere. And I love that you brought up and lifted up the frontline fights and how that's fueling not only the legal challenges, but also the divestment and what we're seeing in the financial community, because ultimately it's the communities, who are creating that risk. It's the folks on the front line. And there was actually just a great report that I saw last week that was put out by Oil Change International and a number of Indigenous leaders and groups that looked specifically at Indigenous and frontline leadership and how that has impacted fossil fuel expansion and infrastructure. Maybe someone can throw the link to that in the chat. But a perfect segue on that point to turn for a question to our last speaker, and then I'll try and take some of the questions that have been coming in from folks around the world. But first, over to you, Brenda Two Bears. Can you talk about the ways in which fossil fuel expansion has impacted your 3 tribes in the United States, and why you feel a wind down of oil, gas, and coal and a fair transition is really imperative for your community?
Thank you, Sephora. Hello, everyone. So I just put the link in the chat that to the report that Sephora was talking about, which was done by OCI, as well as one of our Indigenous partners, the Indigenous Environmental Network. And a really nice tidbit from that report shows that Indigenous resistance has staved off 25% of US and Canada's annual emissions just due to their actions on the ground alone, not to mention everything else that is happening. And so I wanted to share that with everyone. And it's nice sometimes to have a number to put to some of the actions, even though personally, the actions themselves, being able to be there, hear people speaking the language, to be with relatives is something that is very powerful on its own. I grew up knowing about this stuff happening in my backyard. I didn't know there was a name for it. I didn't know that the name for it was colonization and fossil fuel extraction and being taken advantage of. I didn't know that that's what it was. All I knew is that people that I knew would get sick, people that I knew depended on those plants for jobs, for money, for our economy, which is funny because the Navajo Nation is one of the few places in the US, I think possibly the only place in the US that still largely runs with no water, no electricity. And driving out there and having to haul water and knowing that your relatives are going off to work at a coal plant that not only is making us sick, but isn't being used for our people is something that is really hard to grow up with. And that story has a really nice, a better ending than most stories have, which is that they were able to close down that plant, and all of that energy that was being taken to LA and Phoenix and every big city except for the place that they were taking the coal from, decided to step up and step forward and stand up for the Navajo people. And that is really important. Of course, that is not the case everywhere else. And I could go on and name all of the different, instances where these natural resources are taken from the people on land that is already stolen and used for people who already have a lot of money and power. But that list would be very long and there's a lot of fights happening. But I think that it's really important to know and to understand that while there are these spaces being made, for example, the Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change within the space that Indigenous people came up with themselves at the UNFCCC, for all of the Indigenous participants that were going to COP, they created this space for themselves to talk about these instances, and the space within the Paris Agreement that also is there for Indigenous people to talk about these. I fully believe in everything that the treaty is talking about, everything that it wants to do. It's one of the only initiatives that has an actual action that can be used as a tool in those spaces that are made for people to talk about, but not presenting any solutions. And this is one of those solutions that can be presented at COP, that can be presented as a complement to the Paris Agreement. These are the things that the treaty, in my opinion, can really help assist and lift up these fights that are happening on the ground. And it is something that I didn't know could be a job. I never thought that anything like this would ever happen. As someone who grew up seeing this happen in the backyard, someone who started out as an activist and was at the protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline for one of my tribes, Standing Rock, I thought that my future was going to be getting arrested or having another job and doing all of this in my free time. And then I found this job with the treaty, and I realized that this is something that I can really get behind, that I can stand behind, that I can feel proud of, to talk to my people and to the leaders and to spread around throughout my community. And it's something that I do happily, and it's something that a lot of our partners do happily as well, because it is a mechanism that connects the local action to international action on a level that can make some real change. And I am very excited to have been here for the first year. And this is my second time at New York Climate Week. And my first week was actually at the first New York Climate Week when we publicly launched, and it was awesome. And it's awesome to be here now. And so this is a really nice, like, full circle for me. So yeah, thank you everyone. And thank you, Sephora, for speaking with me.
Thank you, Brenna. I mean, not only for sharing those perspectives and stories, but for also all of your work over the last year on helping us understand how to communicate this quite complicated treaty and idea around the world, but specifically your work on talking to youth groups and also organizing with Indigenous leadership. Really excited that Indigenous Environment Network, as well as COICA, the Federation of Indigenous Nations in the Amazon, have joined the treaty. You know, I'm wondering, while I have you, before I move to a couple of other questions, can you share some of your ideas of how Indigenous nations and partners and youth can campaign on the treaty? Like, what are some of the ways? Like, what does it mean to campaign on the treaty now that the idea is out there and it's got some growing momentum? You know, you've been thinking about that question for about a year now and talking to a lot of these groups. So what do you see happening, and what is that going to look like, or what can it look like?
Yes, that's a great question. Thank you, Sephora. Actually, the first option that I always like to share with people is to join a cities campaign. And if someone would drop that link in the chat, that would be awesome. But it's like from my point of view, the quickest step from local to international action that I've seen, especially within the treaty. And it's so very powerful and poignant. And it's a lot easier than people think to get involved in the local action. And we have a cities campaign person that we work with, and you can work with her to start your own campaign, or you can join a campaign that's already been started. Like Sephora mentioned in the beginning, we have international cities around the world that have already endorsed the call for a treaty, and it's a good way to get involved in, because it's such an international kind of action. It's easy to find a place wherever you are to join or to start your own campaign. As for constituencies like Indigenous nations or youth, we have the youth space, and I think we have the link in the chat somewhere, but we hold meetings every few weeks in the run-up to COP. We're having meetings a lot more frequently than that, and like Sephora mentioned earlier, we do have the youth letter that youth can sign on to, and we're going to be presenting it at COP, and so that is something that we welcome all youth to join, and it's not chaired by any one person. Every youth has a voice and has a say in those decisions. As for Indigenous people, we are inviting all Indigenous individuals who have endorsed the treaty, as well as organizations, to meet with me, actually, as we get ready to present to the Indigenous Caucus at COP. That is one of our first actions for our Indigenous constituency within the treaty is to present the treaty from the Indigenous point of view, and it's going to be super exciting, and I'm super looking forward to it.
Awesome. It's been like a weird dream for me this year, watching all of this work happen and take off so quickly. This idea started for me, because of some academics who are working on the concept of fossil fuel supply policy and what a huge gap there is, but also from fighting pipelines and standing on the front line of pipeline debates with the Yankee and with Northern Gateway and the Tsleil-Waututh and Squamish and others here in Coast Salish territory on Trans Mountain. And one of the things I loved in some of our conversations with Gregorio from COICA is he said the reason they're all in on the treaty is that it knits us all together, who have been trying to stop the expansion of fossil fuels, that we can be kind of greater than the sum of our parts. And I think it's really exciting. So some of the questions that I get working on the treaty is, is this a campaign? Is it a political effort, political negotiations and diplomacy, or is it a research initiative? And I think for folks who are joining us for the first time, the answer to that is yes. It is. And over the past year, what's amazing is what's developed is these campaign hubs, groups working on cities, the youth space, a number of different campaign initiatives that all run off the Campaign Hub website. Also a pretty sophisticated research initiative that's looking at tracking supply side policies, developing ways to have more accountability and transparency in supply, starting to do research on some of the legal issues that Nikki mentioned, and also some of the barriers to expansion. What does it look like to have negotiations on production, which we've never had internationally, but from an equitable point of view? So there's groups working on principles for equity that would be involved in those negotiations. So super exciting. And thank you for all your work on the campaign. Let me see, we have 7 minutes left. I'm going to go to a couple more questions for our panelists. Tamara, we had, just I think a week ago, 2 weeks ago, there was a big article in Nature that found that 90% of coal and 60% of oil and gas reserves can't be extracted if there's even a 50% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees. It seems like our survival should be worth more than a coin toss. So can you share with folks how you think the treaty could be a complementary mechanism to Paris to address that issue?
Sure.
Because I think you and I have talked in the past about how weird it is that the words oil, gas, and coal don't even appear in the Paris Agreement. And not to say that this is something that replaces the Paris Agreement, because I think we both know that it's a complement. Like if we don't have it, if we don't do these negotiations, if we don't stop fossil expansion, we can't meet the Paris Accord. But I'm curious about your thoughts of how it might work in practice.
Sure. I mean, one, I think it's hard to replace a thing that doesn't stand in its, like, we can't replace a negative. I don't think we're in a situation where we're in a competition of ideas. We're in a place where we need to be throwing every form of intervention at this problem because we've wasted 3 decades not solving it. I do think there are demands for people to have real solutions that can be partnered with a roadmap for the just transition. I think there are folks who are trying to figure out how do we identify how a pace of change that will not completely disorient people. I think this is a complementary push for those calls, because there are folks in wealthy countries who are outside of the US who use the capital that come from oil and gas to defend themselves from governments they don't want to be in relationship with. So like the just transition isn't just about the worker, it's about entire nations and geopolitics in general, where people are trying to orient themselves to being able to have dignity and safety and not have to fight. And so I do think that as this becomes a more extreme conversation, there are communities in Louisiana who are fighting the dirty words managed retreat, when what they're really fighting is a lack of action at the government level. So I think for folks in those locations, people want to hear that there are more people pulling for us to keep it in the ground, and not just to say that, but to prove it, to do it, and to set up a roadmap for how it happens. That's as true in Florida, where sunny day flooding has become like a norm that people have become used to, in the same way that the expansion of fires have destroyed everyone's plans for the summer. Most of them were already destroyed by the pandemic, but to have something twice destroyed twice hurts. So I do think it's really important for us to flag that in this compound crises, communities that called for protection of air, not to be poisoned, not to be sold out by their government to industry, are also calling for this, because it is a complementary strategy that connects all the places where these seem like disparate fights. So I do think whether folks are running from flood, fire, or managed retreat, whether they're running from government inaction that wants to spend money in the name of people who did not ask to be made a proxy to this, in Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands, communities are fighting not to have the Biden administration send millions of dollars to fund coal, oil, and gas expansion in island nations where they don't have a stake in the matter, because they don't have representation as territories in the U.S. So we don't have to leave the United States or North America to talk about places where community demands line up with the science, line up with the ways that we can actually work, and are increasingly lining up with the economics, because money doesn't matter on a dead planet.
Yeah, so many good points there. And, it reminds me of some of the early days of talking about fossil fuel supply and realizing the disconnect between, our elected officials telling us that they're climate leaders and then approving, more drilling. In Canada, we have a prime minister, and yes, after last night, he is still our prime minister, who is, got a climate plan. At least that's good. We didn't used to have one, and saying he's a climate leader, but has put $20 billion to building Trans Mountain, a new oil pipeline. In the run up to COP26, we've got the UK government, approving drilling in the Cambo oil fields, and they're the COP champion. Like, the disconnect makes no sense. And part of what I love about the fossil fuel treaty campaign is that it's really highlighting that all around the world, that it's raising that bar. And I think, for me, what your words and message, really remind me of is that it's like this transition is happening. Renewables, the price is dropping. There's more and more urgency in ambition and climate policy, of course, because we're all feeling the impacts of climate change, some more than others already, with the fires and the floods, etc. So the decline in fossil fuel production is going to happen. The question is whether it's managed or unmanaged. And if we decide to manage it and plan for it and create mechanisms and agreements to do that, like under a fossil fuel treaty, then it seems to me then it will be more equitable. If it's unmanaged, the market decides, and then people just have crash and burn economic moments.
Or we turn 1 in 4 of us into climate refugees who are increasingly less attached to a place and increasingly vulnerable to political exercise about whether or not we get to have a home. I do think the inevitability of the transition, if you just look at the investments of the people who have told us things are fine, if you look at where they're putting their money, it also says they're betting on sustainable energy, on a habitable planet, just not on a time frame that saves enough of us to enjoy it with them. So I do think having a political strategy around this, connecting the dots on why municipalities are suddenly getting into the fight, as someone who spent many years lobbying municipalities to care about its own constitutional rights at the local level to protect people didn't wake up and decide they suddenly care about it. They realized we can't afford things to be this messed up. People won't put us back in our jobs. We won't be able to park our terrible cars. We won't be able, I think there are real threats to everyday quality of life, and then massive megafauna level issues that we have to be worried about. And they're all happening at the same time. They are not at a truce with one another. So I think if we don't take this moment to stand in our power of demanding the folks who are speaking for us to speak from our voices and leverage what we know, whether it is the storytelling that has become data that we had to use to get in fights we didn't start. Now is the time for us to act. And the treaty is sort of the last civil way for us to do it. I mean, let's be frank. What's coming is not that great unless we start to get into a conversation about how the transition will affect us. Otherwise, the world of climate refugees that destroys most of climate Twitter, my favorite not place on earth, it's really tough to get through a day of climate Twitter without seeing horrifying photos of people who just want safety and dignity. So we're here now. If we want to keep it from getting worse, this is a way to do that.
Exactly. And you've really framed the urgency so well. And I've had people criticize us since we started doing treaty, saying, well, that's unrealistic. A whole new treaty, isn't that a little bold? And I just think that perhaps that's what people thought when the landmine treaties were proposed, or the nuclear non-proliferation treaties were proposed, or any new major international agreement to address a global security threat and crisis. But we're certainly capable of it, and we certainly need bold. I have so many other questions to ask all of you, but we are at the hour, and I just want to thank you all for all of your incredible work and for everything you shared today on this panel. Really appreciate it. And for those of you who have joined us online from around the world and at Climate Week, thank you so much for joining us. You can find out more information about the Fossil Fuel Treaty at fossilfueltreaty.org. Join us. Thank you so much, everybody. Stay safe.